if the West is not able to support through financial debt control, it will take over and present themselves as, it's a shakedown, it's a protection racket. Create the problem and step forward as a solution. Come as a savior, not as a further complication of the problem. Second feature of the current assault on Africa relates to debt. Africa has, over the last 30 years, become addicted to the euro market, the bond market. Governments are able to go in there, and speculative financiers from the US, but also from Europe, will give out money for projects which, on paper, simply don't make sense. But because they know that governments will be able, over time, to find money from somewhere to effect repayments at exorbitant rates, there's just a churn. You have the financial markets, the financial industry, chasing African governments for sovereign debts. So you have all these deals that are backed by the full faith and credits of governments all over the country. And now all those governments are broke and in desperate need of bailouts. So you have countries like Ghana, which just 24 months ago was the darling of the Washington institution, the international finance institutions, is now on its knees seeking an IMF bailout for $3 billion. Just 2 years after receiving something like $6 billion in loans and grants to manage the COVID crisis. Of course, a lot of that money was simply blown. And as I was telling my new friend over here, government can account for it. There's actually an official Auditor General's report before Parliament now, which says that of the $3 billion of a particular facility, contracted for COVID response, less than $200 million went into anything related to the health sector. Forget COVID, anything related to health. They could only find $200 million that went into the health sector. The rest of it into all sorts of things, including building a national cathedral. So where the deepest economic crisis, cathedral, a big church. Okay. Yeah. Now all of these countries are now on their knees, Zambia, for example, and are finding that in order to get IMF bailouts, they need to be in the good books of the Western powers, who typically constitutes the membership of the executive board. So they're all cozying up to the US and France and so on, because on objective terms, they can't actually afford to open up their books for scrutiny. So debt is a huge instrument. The last thing I think you will see is destabilization and militarization. So across the continent, because there are all these underlying discontents, many of which have colonial origins or have been exacerbated by colonial rule, you find that there are large areas where feudal land relations still exist. So you have peasant communities fighting or suppressed by landlords over access to land to produce, over water rights, over all sorts of other rights. You have mistreatment of women. You have marginalization of all sorts of communities based on ethnic, etc. Now, in that context, one of the things we've observed is that for all the countries where you have a majority Muslim population, in the last 15 years, there has been a funded insertion of militant Islamic forces from Central Asia. They have been introduced into the situation to destabilize a lot of corrupt Admittedly, we're talking about corrupt governments. These are not people's governments, but it's the responsibility of their own people to deal with it, not militants from Asia, who suddenly are well-funded, well-armed, and have communication support and so on. There's a lot of evidence that points to that support having come from imperialist forces, Western Europe and the United States. Now that creates the conditions for these same players to step back into the region and present themselves as, it's a shakedown, it's a protection racket. Create the problem, then step forward as a solution. Come as a savior, not as a further complication of the problem. So you find that this is happening certainly across the entire Sahel area, all of which happen to be former French colonies as well. But you're also talking about places like Mozambique, and you find these forces concentrated around areas of high mineralization. That's where they are. They're not out there protecting communities from militant Islam. They're protecting mining operations of big European and American companies. Then, in the middle of this, you have the US in 2007 creating an Africa Command. This is not some diplomatic, support operation, making your military stronger and so on. It coordinates combat operations. At the same time, you have NATO declaring that Africa is its southern border and asserting rights to operate in Africa. So at present, for example, in West Africa, you have US, French, UK, Belgian troops operating across the region. Even so-called pacifists, Germany and Japan, have troops operating in Africa. That is the reality today. The clear statement is that if the West is not able to woo support through media operations, if it is not able to support through financial debt control, it will take over. And again, this may sound far-fetched, but we know from our history that imperialism is more than willing to shed blood, to kill our people for power, and so on. Now, none of these strategies is actually successful. There's huge resistance to all of them. I make the point that Pan-African television, which my comrade here operates, has quickly become one of the most popular stations in Ghana in less than 7 years. And that has worked because people are looking for an alternative. People are looking for a different message, for a different perspective, a different way of understanding the world around them, the world they operate in. So clearly there's scope for pushing back against the current imperialist domination of our media, against the current effort to weaponize our people's thinking against us. By the same token, if you look at the level of chaos that individual countries, for example, my own country, Ghana, are experiencing around the effort to ram down a loan repayment system. Because essentially what the IMF is doing is saying, well, you're going to pay, we're going to give you a little money, which is public resources. We're going to put some public resources into ensuring that you can pay, reach a deal with your creditors, who are huge international banks, to ensure that they get value. Maybe it will take a few more years. And then we'll give you the stamp of approval to go back to them and borrow even more, get deeper into the hole. And in that process, one of the key elements is what they're calling a domestic debt exchange program. Essentially, the government is saying that, well, we borrowed all this money, including from some of you, our citizens. We can't pay. We need to prioritize paying the big boys in the West. So we're not going to pay you. So that means all the pension funds, accumulated workers' entitlement, and so on, are being liquidated. And there's a huge outcry. The government has had to postpone its deadline for signing this agreement, which will enable it to sign with the IMF and go back to the markets. I think 10 times now. They've had to do this 10 times now because of the sheer level of public resistance and the sheer level of popular mobilization that's taking place. You even have now, I mean, it's probably unheard of it, but my recollection, you even have the immediately past Chief Justice of the country in the streets demonstrating and saying that, sorry, I'm a lawyer, this is the law, you can't do this, and if I was still a sitting judge, this is the way I would have ruled. In our domestic politics, it means a lot. And then I think the third, and these are just instances, but the resistance to even the military occupation strategies is growing. In West Africa, we found the regimes that have allowed US troops in are facing stiff resistance. In the last 2 years, there have been successful coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and in the process, French troops have been evicted from Burkina, from Mali, and the two countries are talking about a possible unification. So these are just some highlights about the kinds of trends that we're seeing emerge on the African continent. Thank you very much.